They are coming.
They're coming fast. Francis Brassard, he's a lecturer at in where I was in Dubrovnik. Great guy.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And George, of course, is there. George Simons. Francis, welcome. Happy New Year. And
you are mute. You are mute, Francis.
Okay.
Okay. Hello from ICC Languages. Thank you all for coming to our January, the New Year, the first one of the New Year webinar. I would like to thank Alan accepting to join us and giving us this webinar. And Mary will be our moderator for this webinar. For all of our webinars, he is our moderator, and I want to leave the floor to Barry. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nazan. And it's great to be with you. So happy New Year to everybody. If I haven't had the chance to say that already. And it's a real honor and delight to be able to introduce Alan Maley. We've known each other for a lot of years. I think, Alan, since you were director of the British Council in Paris, and actually has worked all over the world as a director of the British Council. He's also a past president of IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. Has actually worked for Oxford University Press and was involved in editing a couple of the books I wrote with Susan Stempleski, a friend and a colleague in New York, and we wrote books on international culture and the use of film in teaching. And not long ago on ICC Magazine 2, I had the, just published in December, we had the opportunity of reviewing this wonderful book, Using Wisdom Stories in Language Teacher Education. And you wonder how the ideas can get more interesting and more unusual than you might expect. So Alan's going to talk about it, and then we'll be able to take discussion and questions on it afterwards. So Alan, welcome. Great pleasure to have you online, and we're listening and watching.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. Can we go to the split screen now? Yes, thank you very much. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice. I've never done anything for ICC before, so you know, it's a new experience. I have no idea who you are, unfortunately, and you know, this distance mode, which we've all got used to these days, is I still find quite alienating, actually, because I can't really, you know, look you in the eye and get the sense of whether I'm making any sense or not. But anyway, yeah, I'm going to talk about this. I mean, all of these things are in that book. I'm not pushing the book particularly. I'm pushing the ideas more than anything. So could we move to the first slide, please? I'm not going to read everything aloud. These are just things to get us kind of started thinking. I like the A.G.P. Taylor one in particular, because everybody knows that something is inevitable once it's happened. But before it happens, nobody knows. And the whole thing of unexpectedness is, I think, fundamental to teaching. And unfortunately, the way that it's construed very often is that everything can be predicted through lesson plans and the rest of it. And I would challenge that quite seriously. But I mean, that's not the topic today. Anyway, could we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, I just want to talk about because all of this is within the framework of what I call the development imperative. The fact that in order to remain alive mentally, you've got to keep moving. You've got to be looking for something, and changing, basically. If you stay the same, things will not go well. And dear old Dewey, way back, actually before 1963, unless you retain your intellectual curiosity throughout your whole career, then things will not go well, basically, and you'll end up a very unhappy person on top of it. So these are just to remind us. Could we have the next slide, please? I'm not arguing that what I'm talking about here is the only way of doing things. Teacher development or continuing professional development, you can do it in many different ways. This is just one of them. But I think that opening up discussion about issues is important, getting it out on the table and, sharing views, sharing experiences. These things are important. And some people prefer to work on their own, and that's perfectly fine. I spend a lot of time working on my own. Some people enjoy the support of a group, which is something that I also do, although the group is not a teaching group, it's a writing group. And I think we need to remember that CPD really is the initiative of the individual teacher. It's not the school. I mean, many schools do take this on as one of their responsibilities, and that's good, provided they don't impose a program. I think the program has to arise from the felt needs of the people who work in the institution, not the other way round. Anyway, can we move on, please? Next one. Okay, so I'm going to talk for the rest of this session about 6 different ways of looking at discussion. First of all, wisdom stories, and then teacher anecdotes, poems, quotations, and metaphors, and extracts from books, discussions based on books, that is. Critical incidents. So these 6 things. Okay, next slide, please. So what are wisdom stories? You may or may not be familiar with wisdom stories, so I'll just roughly tell you what I think they are. They're stories that work on more than one level. So they're open to multiple interpretations. And that's a good thing in itself because it leads to discussion. They're often allegorical, so the meanings are not stated, they're suggested, and you make meanings from them according to your own understanding of them. On the surface, they're often absurd, or paradoxical, or illogical, or ambiguous, or irreverent, or nonsensical, all of these things. And as dear old Shakespeare said, by indirections, find directions out. So rather than going head on to something, I'm aiming off for wind, if you like. So that's my understanding of what wisdom stories are. Next slide, please. And where do they come from? Well, they come from all over the place. We've got, obviously, things like the Sufi stories, which are one of the prime sources, Nasruddin stories from the Middle East, Zen stories from Japan, prankster stories, fables, La Fontaine and others, Aesop, Jewish stories, lots of them, very funny, some of them. Urban myths, folk tales, and then personal anecdotes and jokes and mini sagas, and more up-to-date things like, James Thurber or Borges or people like that, who often write stories which are enigmatic and open to interpretation. So there are plenty of sources for these things, and I'll give you a few sources at the end of the talk if you're interested. Okay, could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a few of these stories, so you get a flavor for them. Now, the first one, the Master Archer. The Master Archer can be told in several ways. I'll tell it this way. It starts with a very successful teacher in a classroom. He makes quite a lot of noise during his classes, but it's always a contented sort of noise. And one day the school headmaster comes by and says, I noticed that your classes seem to be going very well. They're rather noisy, but they seem to go well. And how do you do this? And so the teacher says, let me tell you a story, headmaster. And he tells this story. There was once a very powerful king who was also a master archer. He really fancied himself, and he'd been away winning competitions, and he was on his way back to the capital, and he stopped in a small town for a drink. And as he was sitting in the cafe, he looked across, and there was a big barn with a very, very long wall. And all along the side of the barn, there were targets. And in the dead center of each target, there was an arrow. And he thought, my goodness, there's somebody around here who knows how to shoot arrows. I must find out who it is. And so he calls around, and people bring him a young lad of about 15 years old. And he says to the boy, did you do this? And the boy says, yes. And how do you do it? Oh, he said, it's very simple. I'll show you. So he takes his bow and arrow and shoots it at a part of the wall where there is no target. It hits the wall, and then he runs into the barn and comes out with a pot of paint and a brush, and he paints around the arrow. So the arrow is bound to be dead center. And the teacher says to the headmaster, well, you see, to answer your question, that's how I teach. First, I shoot the arrow, and when I find out where it lands, then I paint the target of the lesson around it. So that's just one example. Let's go to the last one. How long will it take? This is about a Zen master, and a young acolyte comes along and says, master, I want to get enlightenment, and I will really work very, very hard at it. I assure you, I'll do everything that I have to do. I'll make the sacrifices necessary. Can you please tell me how long it will take me? So the Zen master says, it should take you about 10 years. And the young man says, but really, that's a long time. And I assure you that I will do everything. I promise that I will work very hard. I'll put in all the work that's necessary. And how long do you think it'll take if I do that? So the Zen master says, well, in that case, it will probably take you 20 years. Let me tell you the one about the cutting edge. The cutting edge is about a competition for foresters. and there's an international competition, and it ends up with two finalists. One is from Sweden and one is from the United States. And they both have a patch of forest which they are to clear. They have a fixed time, and they both start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they have to clear it by noon. So they both start chopping away, chopping away, chopping away. And at a certain point, the American realizes that the Swede there's no noise coming from his patch. But then it starts again. And this happens about every hour. And when time's up at midday, the American is amazed to see that the Swede has actually cleared the whole of the patch, 100% cleared. Whereas the American guy has still got about a quarter of it to do. And he's absolutely amazed. And he said, you know, well, how come? You know, you kept on, every now and again, I heard you stop. What's going on? How did you manage to, you know, to beat me? And the Swede says, well, yeah, every hour I stop for about 10 minutes to sharpen my axe. So I'll tell you just one more of these and then we'll move on because time is the essence. The Lost Keys. The Lost Keys is a Nasruddin story. And it's about Nasruddin, this holy fool. He's in his yard in front of his house, looking around, looking, and his neighbor looks over the wall and says, Nasruddin, what are you doing? What are you looking for? And Nasruddin says, well, I'm looking for my keys. I dropped my keys. I'm looking for them. So the neighbor says, okay, I'll come over and help you. And the two of them are looking around the yard in every nick and corner. And after about a quarter of an hour, they still haven't found the keys. And the neighbor says, look, you know, the keys are not here. Obviously not. Do you remember where you dropped them? Have you any idea? And Nasruddin said, well, I have a strong suspicion that I dropped them in the bedroom. So why are we out here looking for the keys in your front yard? Well, said Nasruddin, there's more light out here. Okay. Can we have the next slide, please? I mean, there's obviously many ways of using these. My preference is just for simple prompts to get people thinking about the story. But there is also a more structured approach. So if we could just have the next slide, please. Okay, so these are simple prompts. So for example, the Master Archer story that I just told you, these might be prompts for getting discussion going. You know, what are the implications of that story for lesson planning, for example? Is all teaching a form of improvisation? And what would be the risks of adopting that way of teaching in an institutional teaching situation? So you can see how this might develop into a discussion. The cutting edge one, the one about the foresters, you might ask, you know, does teaching harder lead to more or better teaching? Or better learning, sorry. How do you, in your own work, how do you conserve your energy? Which is a key problem for many teachers, of course. What are the signs of teacher burnout? How can it be prevented or dealt with? I say burnout could also be called shutdown. So these would be some of the simple prompts, and for all the for every story, there's a series of these prompts which people can either use or not use. Could we have the next one, please? If you're working with a group of trainees, you might decide, to use a more structured way. This would be a basic level. These are all techniques which we use in teaching anyway. Retelling the story from memory, getting a title, keywords, and so on. Okay, the next one, please. This is another level, suggesting more than one interpretation of the story, formulating questions to ask the protagonists, acting out a performance of the story, and hot seating with one student in role and the rest asking and challenging questions. Igung is another story, I'm sorry, which I'll tell you if you like, very quickly. Igung is a very old Chinese story. Igung, the foolish old man who tried to remove a mountain. And Igung lived in a small house at the foot of a mountain, and on the other side of the mountain was the sea. And he decided that he wanted a view of the sea, and so he started to remove the mountain, stone by stone. And this went on for a long time until his neighbors said, what are you doing, Igung? And he said, I'm removing the mountain. I want a view of the sea. And they say, but you'll never do this in your lifetime. You can't possibly. He said, never mind, my sons will go on, they'll carry on the work, and eventually we will have a view of the sea. Okay. Mao Zedong, by the way, thought this was a very admirable way of acting. Other people think it pretty stupid, because one of the questions you might ask is, well, why not move your house instead of moving the mountain? So doing stuff like that. The next slide, please. Visualizing, sharing, empathizing, associating, and relating the story to pedagogy, like in Nasruddin and the Keys, for instance. One of the things that emerges from that story very often in the discussion is that what we do in the classroom is what is most convenient to do rather than what is needed. The question of, there's more light out here. We do what's convenient and what's manageable rather than what is difficult and not unmanageable, but just difficult. Okay, next one, please. And there are a whole range of other activities you can do, sharing personal experiences, relating it to a student you have actually taught or are teaching, or to a class, relating it to one's own personal experiences as a learner. I think one of the other things I sometimes talk about is a survey I did called My Teacher, where I asked experienced teachers to think back on their own learning experience and think of a teacher who they remember as being particularly striking or likable or effective, and what made them like that. So relating the story to your own past experiences can be quite a powerful way of getting things going. And making connections, which is the key to really all of the wisdom stories ideas. Okay. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, could we have the next slide, please? So this is the second area that we talked about earlier, discussions based on teacher anecdotes. And I'll just give you two examples of this. One is from Adrian Underhill, whom many of you will know. He may even have done sessions for you, I don't know. He was a great admirer of Caleb Gattegno. Gattegno, as you will probably remember, was the founder of the Silent Way back in the 1970s and 80s. And he ran a summer course every year, and Adrian often took part in it. And Adrian was giving a class, which he'd been asked to teach. And at the back sat Caleb Gattegno, observing it. And Adrian says, he felt that he was actually doing quite well, that, the class was going according to plan and everything seemed to be fine. And all of a sudden, from the back of the class came this voice, "Stop teaching!" And Adrian says he's been pondering exactly what that meant for the last 40 years. What exactly did Caleb Gattegno mean? Well, he's working it out, and he's still working it out. He thought he was giving a pretty good class. So why should he stop teaching? I had a learning experience, if you like, from an anecdote from Earl Stevick many years ago now. I thought I was pretty good, actually. I thought I'd probably got my head around how to do language teaching, and it was, I knew all the techniques and I knew how to do it, and it all seemed to go pretty well. But one day, we were just in informal conversation, and Earl said, "You know what the real role of the teacher is? The real role of the teacher is to kind of set the ball rolling and then to stand out of the light." And that actually profoundly affected the way that I teach or taught, because I don't teach anymore. So a lot of, in the book there are a lot of examples of teacher anecdotes like this, to stimulate discussion of these issues. Okay, could we move along, please? The next one, okay. Discussions based on poems. And this is one of Earl Stevick's. I won't read it for you because you can read. And I think you can see the kind of discussion that this might give rise to. If you don't mind, I'm going to read another poem. It's too long to put on the screen, so I'm afraid you just have to listen. This is a poem called "The Teacher," and it's a poem for two voices, a member of the public and a teacher. And it goes like this. What do you do? I'm a teacher. What do you teach? People. What do you teach them? English. Oh, you mean grammar, verbs, nouns, pronunciation, conjugation, articles and particles, negatives and interrogatives. That too. What do you mean, that too? Well, I also try to teach them how to think and feel, show them inspiration, aspiration, cooperation, participation, consolation, innovation, help them think about globalization, exploitation, confrontation, incarceration, discrimination, degradation, subjugation. How inequality brings poverty. How intolerance brings violence. How need is denied by greed. How isms become prisons. How thinking and feeling can bring about healing. Well, I don't know about that. Maybe you should stick to language. Forget about anguish. You can't change the world. But if I did that, I'd be a cheater, not a teacher. So again, this is a poem I've used quite often, actually, and it does stir up quite a lot of interesting discussion about, what is it? What are you doing as a teacher? Profoundly, not just, talking about verbs and nouns and meaning and, prefixes and all the rest of it. But there's a great deal more to it than that. And it's a way of setting discussion going about that. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Yeah, these are some of the poems that I've used quite often. Brian Patton, for example, the Minister for Exams, a wonderful poem about exams. Michael Rosen, these are just two of the many poems that Michael Rosen has written about teaching. So there are any number of poems out there just waiting to be used, if you like. Okay, could we have the next one, please? Yeah, another thing that I do, and there are a lot of them in the book, is to simply use quotations to set something going. Prabhu, and as Prabhu, many of you will have heard of, the godfather of the task-based learning approach, who died just before Christmas, unfortunately. Teaching is at most hoping for the best. What do you mean by that? It's an invitation to open up a whole area of what teaching is about. Or coming back to the improvisation one, you cannot run everything by improvising, but you cannot run anything without it. And Daniel Pinnock, who I'll mention again in a moment, a great source of quotations and situations. Teachers' great handicap lies in their failure to imagine themselves not knowing what they know. I think about that. It's interesting. It's a great. We forget quite often, what it's like not to know something and how difficult it is to learn it. Okay, next one, please. These are some more. There are any number of these that you could play. I like the Toscanini one particularly. And the Einstein. I'm not sure if Einstein actually said this. He's purported to have said a great many things. I don't know if he actually said them all, but it certainly resonates with me. And this one opens up the whole, can of worms about testing, which is a can of worms that badly needs opening and possibly emptying. So using quotations in this way is a great way to get discussion going again. Okay, the next one, please. Discussions based on metaphors. We don't unfortunately have time to do these, but these are some of the things that one can ask a group to come up with. What are the metaphors for tests, for example? Or what are the metaphors for the course book? Or metaphors for the teacher as a circus performer? Could we have the next slide, please? And there are 8 possible metaphors for the teacher as circus performer. And you can see in each case, I hope, you know, the kind of teacher that this is. And we can recognize ourselves perhaps in some of these metaphors. Clown, by the way, here is being interpreted as circus clown, obviously. But I would suggest that there are other ways of teachers being clowns, which are not negative, in the sense that we can learn a great deal from theatre clowns in the tradition of, you know, Marcel Marceau and people like that, and Lecoq. Because my friend Peter Lutsky makes this point very strongly, that the teaching situation and the clowning situation are very closely analogous. Because what the clown has to do in order to succeed is not to have a plan, which sounds crazy, doesn't it? But if you have a plan, then you are already engaged in a course of action. Whereas what clowning is reacting to what happens in the moment. So it requires a great deal of patience, among other things, because you have to wait for something to happen. And when it happens, then you act. But I mean, that's another chapter, so we better not talk about that. Okay, next one, please. Yeah, this is the last section, and discussions based on extracts from books. And when I say books, I don't mean professional books, you know, not books about linguistics or anything like that. I'm going to suggest a couple of books. One is Teacher Man. That's the first one there, by Frank McCourt. Another one is this one, Daniel Pénac, School Blues, which is translated from French. And what I usually do is to select particular incidents from these books as a basis for discussion. I'm not going to read the whole of the Teacher Man incident that I have in mind, but I'll just tell you what it was about. Frank McCourt, new teacher, just graduated, you know, from Teachers College, Columbia University, goes to work in a very, very rough school, which has a majority of immigrant kids. His first class, he goes in, there's absolute mayhem, they're teenagers, they don't want to be there, and he doesn't know what to do, basically. And then one of the kids throws a sandwich, and he doesn't know what to do about this. So what does he do? He thinks, this was my first academic act, my first teaching act. And they didn't teach me stuff like this at Columbia Teachers College. You know, they taught me all the professional stuff, but they didn't teach me how to handle this. So in short, he picks up the sandwich, smells it, delicious, and he eats it. And the boy is outraged who threw it. But the rest of the class are suddenly on the teacher's side. It's, come on, you know, you threw the sandwich, he ate it, it's great, you know. And all of a sudden, the class and he are in sync. And it happens that the director of the school comes along, and he has observed the teacher eating the sandwich, and he gets rebuked for it, but the students say, you know, come on, there's nothing wrong about that, you know, we're with you, basically. So there's this interesting little, you know, snippet of experience that you can use as a basis for that. Then Daniel Pénac. I'm going to read some extracts from this, but it won't be too long. One thing is certain. For my students to be present, I have to be present. For the whole class and for each individual in it, and I have to be present for my subject matter too, physically, intellectually, and mentally, during the 55 minutes that my lesson will last. And he says, you know, he has painful memory of the lessons when I wasn't there. How I felt my students drifting away, floating off as I tried to gather my strength. I'm not here, they're not here, we've come unhitched. And yet the hour passes. I play the part of the person giving a lesson, they play the part of listeners. Our collective expression is perfectly serious, blah, 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 on one side, scribbling on the other. An inspector would be satisfied as long as the shop looks open. And, you know, I'm hiding behind the well-oiled lesson. So there's a whole section here about being there, basically, which opens up all manner of discussion. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time, Barry, don't worry. Could we have the next slide, please? So just, you know, reflecting a bit, you know, on the one hand, obviously teachers need technical knowledge and skills. You don't want ignoramuses or idiots running your classes, although some countries seem to be okay with that. And human attributes, on the other hand. And my teacher project that I mentioned earlier on comes down very heavily in favor of human attributes. Surprise, surprise. So perhaps we need to rebalance the emphasis between these two aspects of teaching, the know-how and the spirit of the event, because they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So maybe in teacher training and development, just as in teaching, we could recalibrate a bit. Very often it's a controlled directive kind of paradigm. Could we move to a more responsive, guidance-oriented paradigm? One is characterized by tight planning. Others, perhaps we could move towards a more spontaneous response. One is oriented towards predictability, and unpredictability is in fact the norm, and perhaps we should recognize that. One is oriented towards measurable outcomes. And of course, you measure what you can measure. Perhaps we should be looking more at the depth of the experiential process, rather than simply being concerned with measuring things the whole time. One is closed-ended, and the other one is ongoing process. You know, if you think you've finished, you are finished. So it's better, I think, to look at it as an ongoing process, which is in fact never ended. I mentioned Prabhu, and I'd like to just mention his book. This is a collection of all his published papers in his whole lifetime, 60 years of teaching, and it is absolutely marvelous. There are a great many, you know, key articles in here with key concepts, which could form the basis of a lot of very interesting teacher development work. Just taking one of these articles and taking it to bits, and you know, seeing what we can derive from it. Yes, next slide, please. Yeah, these are just some of the sources for wisdom stories. There are lots of others. I'll leave it up just for a moment, but I guess these things can be made available afterwards in any case. I can send a longer bibliography if people are interested. Okay, the next one, please. And that's the book. It says coming soon, but it's come. And Barry has kindly done a review of it, which I think appears in, is it a website or a webzine or what? Barry?
It's in the latest edition of our ICC journal, which people can get to online through the ICC website, no problem.
All right. So there we go. Next slide, please. Yeah, and good luck, basically. And Morrow used to say this was something similar, no, good night and good luck. He should be saying that now. So thank you for lasting the course, if you did last the course. And yeah, if there are any questions or observations or comments, now's the time, I guess.
I'll just mention one statement. Thank you, Alan. That was terrific and really makes you think. I have got a question to kick off with, but I noticed we had something, and I don't think I've got the pronunciation right, from Rimspahi saying, can we get a, what's the word, a certificate to say we attended the seminar? And the answer is yes. If you write to ICC-languages.eu, then you will be able to ask for a certificate. So please go ahead and do that if you want to. And if you have any difficulty, we'll give you more information. Any questions from anybody? Do feel free to raise your hand or go to chat. I've got 2 comments still in chat. 2 more then. No, that's lovely. Good thumbs up examples, thank you. My question is the obvious one, Alan, so let's get it out of the way. If I'm teaching, let's say, people who are going to become doctors or nurses in hospitals, is this the kind of language exercise I can be doing with them, or should I be sticking with the practical language of what they're going to need to say on a ward?
Well, I would say that you would be doing both. And I think there would be a very important role, in fact, particularly for professions involving communication between a professional and a patient or a client, that to develop your skills of interaction, your depth of understanding, and so on, these things would be very important. In fact, I would be surprised if doctors didn't get some of this anyway, but maybe they don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think, yeah, I would certainly want to include it. And I think it was Henry Widdowson years ago said, you know, what professionals want very often is not information about their profession. They've got that already. Thank you very much. What they want is something more than that. And you know Andrew Wright, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, Andrew is the same age as I am, which is very old, believe me. And he does a lot of one-to-one teaching online now, sadly, in Budapest. And one of the people he teaches is the head of the largest bank in Hungary. And what his lessons are about had nothing whatever to do with banking. That's not what the man wants to talk about. He wants to talk about everything else.
Okay, take that one on board. That is wonderful. Lovely to have the comment about Andrew. Okay, Peter Weber, you have a question, and then we'll go to Francis Brassard. Okay, can you unmute, Peter?
You unmute.
No, sorry, I just a misunderstanding. I just made thumb up. I really enjoyed it, and I know everything what he was telling us about. I'm quite in sync. We are quite in sync, Mr. Maley. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for putting the resources up again, because I noticed that somebody wanted those. But Francis, over to you. Would you like to ask a question?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, all right. Good. Okay, all right. One of the really interesting things from what you were talking about and the examples you were giving, Alan, is this notion that we're taking our examples of wisdom stories from people who were not involved with English or with Europe. You know, it was a completely different angle. How do you feel about that?
I
That
feel
we got
fine.
so much international input.
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I mean, there are where do these stories come from? Well, you're not obliged, of course, to use Nasruddin stories, for example, or Zen stories.
Mhm.
But people, I don't seem to find that a problem mostly. I mean, you can take your examples from urban myths, for example,
Mhm.
or from anecdotes, shared anecdotes with other teachers. I mean, it doesn't have to be exotic. And I wouldn't want to exoticize it at all. You know, this is all part of being human, isn't it? That's my view of it anyway. That, you know, so I'm happy to take the stuff from wherever I find it.
Mhm.
I don't think that most of these things, okay, they are a little enigmatic sometimes, so
Yeah.
you have to think about them, but that's the whole point.
Okay, all right. Any other questions coming up before we move into our close? Just one more thing from me, Alan. And again, it's a horrible question. Let me throw the textbook at you. I don't have time to get through the textbook lessons I'm supposed to in the classes I've currently got. What the hell am I doing playing with all this stuff when I've got the textbook units to get through?
Well, I mean, don't forget that what I've been talking about is teacher development, not classroom teaching.
Yeah.
Although, of course, I mean, many of these things I work very, very well with classes too,
Mhm.
but that wasn't my focus. But of course, the time thing is the thing that comes up time and time again. I don't have time. And there is no easy answer to this, and it sounds glib. There's a thing in German, a quote in German. I can't remember who it's from now. Gott hat wenig Freude an Leute, die keine Zeit haben. God has little time for people who have no time. So, you know, it's really a question of how you organize your time. Everybody has 24 hours a day, exactly the same as everybody else. So it is partly a question of time management. This is not exactly an answer to your question, but one of the ways of finding time is to make sure that you set aside, let's say, half an hour a day at some point in the day when you can be quiet.
Mm.
And, you know, not necessarily think about anything, but think about nothing if possible. And that's the time when good ideas come quite often. Or go for a walk. You know, for me, walking is, I wouldn't know what to do if I couldn't walk every day. I'm lucky. I live in the country. I go for a walk for an hour, let's say, pretty much every day. And every time I go out, I come back refreshed. And I have quite often, I find I write a lot of poetry, and quite often I come back with an idea for a poem or a story or just an idea.
Mhm.
So you can make time, but you have to make it. You know, and I mean, I fully understand, you know, a teacher with a full teaching program is not going to have a lot of time for personal development, but I think it's necessary for their own sanity that they do make some time available, at least to think about things, not necessarily to get this book and work their way through it, no, but you know, to make time for reflection of one kind or another. Yeah.
Good. No, that makes the point. Very last point coming up from the chat, which I think is quite relevant to what you've been saying, Alan. You cited a lot of pieces that obviously you weren't able to write up on your presentation. And also the question is, I think it is worth thinking about extending the resources, to have Prabhu in there, and also to have the example, not the examples, but the references to the pieces that you read out to us, but actually weren't actually printed out in the
Yeah,
text.
yeah. I mean, one thing I didn't mention is this, which is freely downloadable, British Council publication. And this is these are teachers' stories, basically the stories of their lives, how they became what they are.
That's interesting. Could you hold it up again?
Sure, I can. Yeah, but I mean, if you
Mhm.
like, I can send.
Yes, go on, please.
If you go on the British Council website, Teaching English, I think it's called.
Yep.
You can find freely downloadable books, and this is one of them. But if you like, I can send you an expanded list of resources and stuff.
I think it would be good, and then we can put that in the ICC journal and
Okay.
online so people can
Yeah.
actually.
I may not be able to do it this week, but maybe next week I'll try and do it because I've got a couple of deadlines coming up.
Mhm.
So, Alan, thank you so much for what everybody says is an absolutely fascinating session, which it was, and really very enriching. And in saying thank you, I think, Nazan, it's time to pass it back to you
Yeah.
to close down the show. Yeah.
First, I would like to start with thanking Ellen. Ellen, thank you very much. It is very inspiring presentation. I like the saying here, as a teacher, we need to present physically, also intellectually and mentally. I totally agree with this idea, and thank you very much for your presentation. The ideas, they are really, I love them. And I would like to share with you our coming events and the other things about ICC. For a moment, I would like to thank you all as a participating in our webinar. And 1 minute. Okay.
Can I just say something before you do that?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
I'd just like to thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I enjoy these sessions, and it helps me to keep myself on track. So thank you once again. And thank everybody for coming. Thank you.
Yes. And yes, as ICC, we are organizing our annual conference in Cyprus, where I also live in Larnaca, on 9th and 11th May. You can find it is about defining language education, technology, accessibility, and empowerment. And it will be in May. You can find the details on our webpage. And another one, as Mary mentioned, we have ICC Journal. These contains articles on theory and practice in language education and more. And as we learned, we will put the references mentioned by Ellen there also. And so here we shared new ideas for lesson development, teacher development, materials, technology tools, and new books. It is free subscription. You can visit our webpage also for this, ICC languages. And we also have a course, EUROLTA, European Certificate in Language Teaching to Adults. It's a teacher training program developed by the ICC to equip individuals with modern language teaching methodologies. Upon completion, participants are awarded an internationally recognized certificate. So you can find information about that one. And also, if you become the membership, it is our association is non-government organization and member of the professional network format, the European Center of Modern Languages, ECML, a unique institution at the Council of Europe. ICC sets standards for a transnational network of language educators and learners. We will be very happy if you join us, so you can visit our website. And for the thank you all for your participation. For ICC members, upon request, your certificates will be provided, certificate of attendance. And also you can follow our web page for our follow-up webinars. We will announce them soon, I think. There will be some more. And if you don't have anything to add, Barry, this will be the end of the webinar, today's webinar. And thank you very much, Ellen, again.
Okay, we've had two
Thank you.
questions. We've had two questions very quickly. We're on 1700, but never UK time. Either send them to me if you like. I know, Ian, you had a question you wanted to ask about how this applied to business English teaching. And I think Alan's answered the question, but is there anything else you need to ask about that? If not, don't worry about it. The other thing I thought, just the last one really, Alan, your talk has left me thinking. I have one extra question. Here we go. How has interpretation advanced methodologically, or is it the usual expansion of meaning and thought that's in the text? Is that something you can answer quickly, or is it a...
Can you ask the question again, please?
I couldn't agree with you more. How has interpretation advanced methodologically, interpretation, or is it the usual expansion of meaning and thought that's in the text?
I don't really know how to answer that.
I'm not sure I do either. Maria, if you want to send me that or send ICC that, I'll pass it across to Alan and we'll get a proper, a reasonable response to you. It takes a little bit of thinking about. I agree with Alan on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so let us know. Good. Okay, Nazan, I think that's it.
That's it. Yes. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you again.
See you in our next event. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.